לא התכוונתי, אתה רצינית.
Yeah, the recording was
I said, שלושה אחוזים. רציתי לעשות שינוי, התכוונתי לעשות תיקון. מתקבל יותר סגור. די מביך. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay. So it's a pleasure to start this year's series of seminars. As a seminar, it's nice to see quite a few of you are here. For the faculty members here, I ask you, I should have given you, but ask you, please encourage all of your students to come, even if they're not their favorite or topic or the topic of work. I personally think that you usually get more of lectures that are outside the scope of your work. And it would be nice to get more students here, except the first 2 years that it's mandatory for them. But for the rest of the year, I think we have a pretty balanced lineup. People from, we have cognitive talk, theoretical talks, we have AI, and of course systems, neuroscience, and a bit molecular. So try to follow up. It's a good opportunity for all of us to meet, to hear ideas together, to talk, and we'll have happy hours, at least every other week. Today we'll have one, so you're welcome to stay afterwards. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Tatyana Sharpee from the Salk Institute at San Diego. Tanya is a theoretical neuroscientist whose work bridges physics, information theory, and sensory neuroscience, exploring how brains represents and optimize information under real-world constraints. Tanya trained as a theoretical physicist at Michigan State University before transitioning into neuroscience as a Sloan Schwartz postdoc at UCSF. Her research has provided deep insight into how sensory systems adapt how neurons encode information efficiently, and how internal models of the world guide perception and action. The group combined theory and data to uncover organizing principles that apply across different modalities. In recent studies, Tatyana revealed that perception from smell to spatial navigation follows a hyperbolic rather than a Euclidean geometry, and some of you may remember hearing about this discovery last year when Tanya was here and she gave the Heller Lecture in Computational Neuroscience. She was elected as a fellow of the American Physical Society in 2019 and won the 2022 Delano Award for Computational Biosciences for her innovative views of computation in the life sciences. Tanya is visiting ELSC for a prolonged period, and she'll be here until November 11th, so you're all welcome to reach out and catch her for a chat. She's also giving a mini course on information theory of neural circuits and behavior, and it's on Sunday, I think it's Sunday noon. Today she share her work on perceptual distortion in visual and proprioceptions can facilitate optimal motor control, and how geodesics in hyperbolic spaces describe optimal movement trajectories. Please join me in welcoming Tanya.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction and for the opportunity to present again. So, as Jonathan mentioned, I spoke here about less than a year ago. So today I will provide an update on what new things I learned and update on the maybe questions, and I hope it will be with some overlap, but it will be new things. So the questions that will be posed, but maybe not necessarily addressed, is that, why is our perception distorted, and what kind of perceptions are best for motor control? And I will try to provide a series of arguments for why, if both motor systems and the visual perceptions have hyperbolic geometry, then that facilitates accuracy of movement and learning. And there will be potential for a little bit of molecular things into our insights into aging at the molecular and behavioral scales, also as an active sensing problem. So we thinking about distortions and what does it mean, the absence of distortions. So it begins with Euclid, with our geometry that we learn in school, that the distances are, we have 5 postulates from the Euclid, and how to perceive the world around us. And the distances themselves are, with the Cartesian coordinates, were designed or discovered by René Descartes. And I like this cartoon. Some of you might know, maybe I spoke about it a year ago, I don't recall, that how he discovered his Cartesian coordinates. Do you remember? No? So it's ingenuity of how you should use your downtime wisely. So he was sick. He wasn't a healthy person. So he was sick, and he was lying down, and he was watching a fly. And then he saw that, the distance between the fly and the corner is the sum of squares along the 2 lines, x squared and y squared. So he was actually a neuroscientist also. But turns out that if you were to measure his perception and our perception more accurately, then it wouldn't be quite Cartesian, and it would be more hyperbolic in many different ways. And in this, at ELSC, there's a integration between science and art, and when it comes to hyperbolic geometry, Asher is the one who popularized this, and he was interested in human perception and how we zoom in on the central part and the rest of the space is compressed. And as an artist, you're interested in capturing properties of human perception, but it turns out to be, I would say, accurate from computational perspective. So this picture is generated using a mathematical formula. You take the inside image, and then you tile this hyperbolic space according to a formula, and it takes the infinite plane and it compresses it into a finite circle. And that's the foundation for some of the visualizations of hyperbolic geometry that I will describe. And another example that our kind of everyday example is that babies try to reach out for the moon. It's actually perceptually much closer than the actual physical distance. So there are a few examples of these distortions, and another set is that if the room is straight, then it will be perceived as a curved room. And for us, so this is a subject, left and right eye, and if they are stationary, you have to make the room curved in order for it to be perceived as a straight room. And turns out there's the saying that everything new is a well-forgotten old. Do you know the saying? It's a Russian saying. So, but anyway, so it turns out that the Greeks knew about this. And and the term is called entasis. And apparently they wanted the columns to be straight. And so for the columns to be perceptually straight, they had to make them a little bit rounded. And also another construction in the horizontal plane, so the arches are a little bit, so they say diagram of exaggerated proportion, but they knew they had to make them bent in order for people to perceive them as straight. So, any questions so far? Any objections? So there are objections. So there are other evidence of measurement that I was inspired by originally by Lüneburg and his measurement of the alleys. You can measure. You ask people to create sets of lines out of lights. Like for example, you are expecting guests to your house along the driveway, and you want to eliminate the driveway such that the lights are equidistant, or if they are parallel. And if the perception is Euclidean, then these two sets of lines should be the same, but turns out they are different. And by making this measurement, you can determine the hyperbolic parameter of individual people and assign them a value. And generally, the bigger the space, the more resolution the person has. So this is in the visual domain. Turns out there are distortions in the proprioception domain in terms of how we perceived our hands. And this is, I'm starting a new collaboration with Cristina Beccio, and so that's her published data, where in red is the actual hand, and then in position is how do we perceive. So it turns out the hand, instead of being perceived where it is, it's always, most of the time, is perceived closer to the body and kind of wider. And all the fingers are distorted. You know, they're shorter and wider, and the face is distorted. So all kinds of distortions. And similarly, for example, in the haptic space, you can measure the, you know, what do you think are the straight lines, and they are distorted. And the implication is that the reason that they are distorted is that whatever is the motor distortion, then maybe perhaps the visual distortion should be matched to the motor, that they should be matched. If one is going to be distorted, maybe the other one should be distorted. So, but the question is why? I will skip the slides for now, and I wanted to tell you what, why I think, you know, what the things I learned in the past year about why hyperbolic geometry and these types of distortions can be good for motor control. So what is a hyperbolic geometry? And so the Euclidean geometry was well established, and there were two people who independently published this, Nikolai Lobachevsky in Kazan University and Balai also in Hungary. Do you know the story? Nikolai Lobachevsky sent his paper to St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences, where it was rejected because he was going against one of the Euclidean postulates. Balai also couldn't publish it. So his father was also a mathematician, and he told me, just please, don't go into hyperbolic geometry. It will suck the light out of your life. And but he persisted as a young fellow, and it was published in the appendix to his father's textbook. So it doesn't matter where you publish and when you publish something. So
you have to select your parents.
That's right. So the idea is that if we look at spaces of constant curvature, there are only three possibilities. The curvature can be flat, as in Euclidean geometry. It can be positive, as in the sphere, or it can be negative, as in the hyperbolic space. So these are the three options: hyperbolic, negative, straight cylinder with a zero curvature, and a positive for a sphere. And why is hyperbolic interesting? I'm going to skip everywhere we found it. It is interesting because it describes a tree-like network. So if you think about this hyperboloid like this, then it expands. So it expands just like a tree-like network. And we have tree-like networks in many places in biology, and there are different ways to visualize it. One of them is, of course, through phylogenetic trees. And if you have representation, then the distance between 2 points is not straight along this axis, but the appropriate distance along the graph would be to find the last common ancestor and go back up. So the curve is, the trajectory is bent towards the center of the network. And so that's one of the visualizations from Poincaré, who was also thinking about hyperbolic geometry. And he developed a few visualizations. One of them is called Poincaré half-plane. And you can think of this as a discrete version of a network. So we have a node, and each time we have a square, we're going to subdivide it in half and so on. So there is an increasing subdivision that approaches the line of 0 that is actually unattainable. So you will have infinite resolution. And then, because it's an approximation, you can have analytical expression for lines of shortest distance between points A and B. So if you count how many squares you have to cross between A and B, and you want to minimize it, then you don't want to go straight because there's a lot of resistance in that direction, but you might want to go up, cross a few big squares, and then go down. So that's the explanation. So this is what I learned for the past year. And the question was, so we are looking at the various data sets. It can be perception, it can be gene expression, it can be neural responses, it can be metabolic networks, and we find the hyperbolic geometry everywhere. Different curvature, different dimensionality, and the question is why. So there must be some, and here is my answer, there must be some very fundamental reason. So what can be more fundamental than a Gaussian? So imagine that you have two Gaussians, and you want to evaluate distances between them. We know that the distances between two Gaussians, between A and B, is the difference between the mean normalized by the standard deviation, because the ruler for a Gaussian is how wide it is. So, and by some miracle of mathematics, this distance, which is described by the distance in the means, plus if they have different variances, will be also a difference in their variances. But the mean is divided by the variance. This is the metric precisely of hyperbolic geometry. So anytime you want to measure distances between variables that have approximately Gaussian statistics, and then the parameters of the Gaussian, which is the mean and the variance, describe the hyperbolic geometry. In other words, the Gaussians that are wide will live on this side. I don't know if you can see my cursor here. Like this. So broad Gaussians will live on this side, and the narrow Gaussians will live on that side. And so now what is the meaning of this trajectory? So in other words, so the hyperbolic plane you can think of as the width of the Gaussian on the y-axis and the mean of the Gaussian on the x-axis. And now it becomes clear why this y=0 line is unattainable, because you cannot get infinitely delta functions in real life. So why is this geodesic important? So it turns out that in non-equilibrium statistical physics, people ask a question about what is the best way to move one probability distribution fast from one position to another. And so there are two options. A canonical way, I'm here and I want to move here, so I just dutifully move in small steps. So they call it a natural path. Turns out this natural path is very inefficient. What instead should happen is that you know your starting position as a Gaussian, say a blue Gaussian, and you want to move it to a red location. So in the middle, when you're moving things, you have to spread out. So because this is not something that is constrained. What is constrained is the variance at the starting position and the variance at the final position. But during the movement, you spread out, yes.
When you said inefficient, what's the metric for efficiency here?
Yes, so the dissipation. So they ask, you have to do work, and how much extra work you do compared to infinitesimally slow part. So that's the dissipation part. So they measure, you can say work, how much work it is. We can go over math in more detail. I didn't quite prepare these slides for the math, but is there another question? I thought there was in the back. No?
Well, but what's the, like, I understand the concept, but where do you see the brain needs to move Gaussian from one point to the other?
Well, as a theorist, I was thinking that maybe, I have a hand here and I want to move it there. No?
Okay. Yeah, okay.
No? So I have, a neural population encodes position of my hand and then, and so on. So it turns out there are a few interesting solutions to this problem. And for example, the question is how much to spread out in the middle. And according to, so it turns out that these geodesics in the space of the parameters, so one can, the way geodesics come up is because this now becomes, each point is a probability distribution, and you can compute, so we are talking about Fisher information between two Gaussians, and this is the distance between, in Fisher information between various Gaussians, and the metric, which is this hyperbolic metric, describes the distance between probability distribution. And so when we integrate over this path, that's the total amount of work that we have to do to move from one position to to another position. And the question is how much to spread out, and that's the optimal part is described by geodesic. If I spread out the distribution too much, then I won't be able to gather it back together. But then there are interesting kind of discrete effects. It turns out that if the initial location and the final locations are too far in terms of how narrow, if the variance is too small and the distance is too large, I cannot do it in one optimal geodesic, as in on the right. Instead, I have to do it in small, discrete jumps. So you move, you spread out, you gather, and then spread out and gather. And the number of jumps also is a prediction from a theory depending on the starting location, the final location, and how far you move. So the conclusion from this theoretical work is that the hyperbolic geometry describes lines of shortened distance which correspond to optimal control trajectories between Gaussian distributions.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you give a little bit more information about the forces that create this work that you need to do?
Well, so what people have done is in a very basic form, suppose you have kind of, what does it mean non-equilibrium? It means that suppose you have some kind of a Brownian motion within some potential well, and you can control the temperature and the width, this kind of how steep that potential well is, and the temperature. And so, you know, the work that they have done in physics is, in this case, the potential is created. It's optical tweezers or something like that. So now, thinking back to neuroscience, then it's created by neural signals.
Okay, so it's a force that needed to change the potential where? So you have
Well,
particles in Brownian motion.
So the idea is that you create an equilibrium distribution, for example, at 0, and then that's where it needs to go. But then you perturb the potential, and the distribution is at some other location, and then to see how I should change my potential to bring whatever was initial to the final state. So that's the question of what are the control trajectories in the space of parameters that minimize work? As in in the simple problem, it is the mean of the potential, its width, and the temperature. So those are 3 control parameters that would describe the Gaussian distribution.
Kind of, I mean.
Is that
Even
helpful?
like a quadratic potential, you have a
Quadratic
solution, but
potential,
then
yes.
you just need how to set what the energy of the image.
Yes. So these are the 3 parameters: temperature, the width, and the location. And so that's my explanation for why we see hyperbolic geometry in many different systems, because it allows for optimal control. And now I will describe what 2 little problems, one in the neural systems and the other one is molecular aging. So the neural part, with apologies to those who had heard it before, it is a representation of space. And in many cases, for example, this this data was from say1, but you think about how we perceive space and whether I need to encode all locations between final and starting locations uniformly, or whether I can create a multi-scale representation with different place cells such that I can encode location from point A and point B, not in terms of connecting place cells of the same size, but engaging place cells of different sizes. So this particular data was from hippocampus, and this is a depiction of a place cell, which most of you know, but for completeness, so it's a region in space where a neuron responds when the animal runs through that location. And what has been shown by a number of groups is that these place cells come in different sizes, and some are large, some are small, and it becomes, and they can even have multiple regions. And it turns out that from this overlapping set of regions, you can construct a network by a mathematical construction where the size of the network, the size of the circle encodes its Z location. So a big place cell gets to be assigned a node on top of the network. And the one that is included in it is a smaller network with smaller Z. Any questions? No? So, yeah. So it turns out this is the scheme that apparently Darwin knew when he constructed his tree of life. So this is the historical, in history of science. There's a paper about how networks were represented before Darwin, and they were represented as these overlapping circles. And you can apparently, so you can't quite see, but in here there's a Homo sapiens in there. That's the central circle. And apparently he knew about this mathematical construction, and he transformed the same data, but from overlapping circles into a tree-like structure. So that's what we are trying to do. So in this particular data, this was from large environments, and you can see a track from Geneva Research Campus, their data, and the animal is running around the track, and sometimes there are parts of the track that are curvier than others, and so the animal runs slower, and it turns out that when it runs slower, it creates more detailed representations of the environment, and so the curvature for those segments becomes larger. Also, what is shown on this graph here is different place cells as a function of the distance along the track. And you can see big ones, the one that's spanned as much as the meter on the y-axis, and a lot of small ones. And another feature in the data is that the track was opened up in quarters. So the first quarter was experienced for longer than the second, and so on. So you can see the depth of the network is larger in the first quarter of the track. But these are qualitative statements that one can, we will quantify later. But the first argument for studying whether the network is consistent with hyperbolic geometry is to plot whether the place field sizes is exponential. And if you plot it, then it is consistent with an exponential distribution. And for this type of data, exponential and log normal are. Now, if you have a set of, but there are various caveats to this analysis. One of them is that often each neuron will have multiple place cells, and so how to determine this network construction if they have multiple place cells. So instead, you can compute correlation between neural responses, and that is independent of whether or not they have a place cell, one or many, or whether they have it at all. So once, and then in this way you can compute the distances between neurons, and And once you have distances between neurons in one measurement, you can then ask kind of an embedding question: what are these distances imply in terms of the manifold? So, for example, if I give you the distances between cities and Earth, you can find how big it is. You can find the curvature. So you start with a distance matrix, and then you also have points on different geometries, and then you can test against three possibilities: negative curvature, zero curvature, and positive curvature. And we have developed a set of methods to choose from, and other people too, about how to fit a given set of distances onto a given surfaces. So you can have a topological method, you can have multidimensional scaling metric methods, you can have non-metric multidimensional scaling, you can have t-SNE with hyperbolic metric or without. So there is a suite of methods available on GitHub for all of them. But for these purposes of this talk, we will just compare distances between data and various geometries. Yes.
How many points do you need in order for these measurements to make sense? How many distances?
The smallest is about 60.
60?
60.
So I have 60 by 60, matrix of 60 by 60.
Yes, I think that would be the smallest for which we were successful to infer a surface. And then the largest that we worked was 80,000 in the case of gene expression data. And so these methods, they differ in terms of how many data points they can take. The topological method can take at most 100. After that, it becomes not possible. And then there was this kind of desire to analyze bigger and bigger data. So this Bayesian hyperbolic MDS or multi-scale, you can, at best, we can now handle about 80,000 samples.
Each point on the manifold represents a neuron or neuron's activity or population activity at a certain time point. What are
So each point can represent a neuron, but you can always embed either neurons or you can embed stimuli. And in principle, you can embed both neurons and stimuli together. So that would be with matrix factorization problems. So you put stimuli, so I can say, these are my neurons, and they're probed by various different stimuli, and you evaluate distances between neurons, and you put neurons into the manifold. Or you could say, these are my stimuli, and I evaluate distances between stimuli based on their physical characteristics. And then you can say, well, and embed that. Or you can take, these are my stimuli, I represent them by how the neurons were activated. So you have distances between stimuli based on neuronal activation in the first layer, for example, and embed that. And then you have the same stimuli represented by neurons in the second stage, and you embed this. And you can see how the stimulus transformation changes across stages of processing. And then with matrix factorization method, which says that you constrain both the stimuli and the neural kind of receptive fields, if you will, to live in the same space with the same matrix. And then you can just put all the data in and says come up with a joint representation. And so then there is matrix factorization, and there are papers on hyperbolic matrix factorization. Yes?
Maybe I misunderstood. So are you, is this data, is the distance on some plane, like a navigation, or it's a high dimensional space and you're trying to see the space is
Okay, so the animal runs around depending on the data set. In this particular data set, it's approximately one-dimensional, but could be said two-dimensional because it sees a little bit. We also looked at Buzaki's data that I will be showing, where the animal runs in the two-dimensional space. So that's dimensionality of the space, but it's like different stimuli to the neural responses. So the true dimensionality is not necessarily known. And you can, because this is just like different ways of probing the neural circuit. And then each stimulus is represented by the neural activity, and you evaluate the distances between neurons integrated over whatever that path was. And in this particular data set, what we found was that depending on the session, the dimensionality of the best fitting space varied between 2 and 5. On average is 3. So 3-dimensional hyperbolic space is great because it says space is 2-dimensional plus 1 hierarchical dimension for the kind of big to small. And you get 3-dimensional hyperbolic space. But depending on the data set, the dimensionality can be less or more. And so the way I explained it to myself is that the real neurons code perhaps not only about space, but about events and other things that we don't know. And that shows up in the neural activity. And by using these dimensionality reduction methods, you can estimate what is the dimensionality of the manifold.
But, so maybe it's too theoretical, but there could be spaces where they're hyperbolic and they have mixed curvature
Yes.
and such spaces.
So, of course. So, most of the time, so when we talk about hyperbolic space right here, what I will be showing, actually the representation of space looks like that. So it actually looks like a sphere, but the metric inside of it is different. So you can have spherical coordinates, spherical symmetry in the data that is inherited, the neural response is inherited. For example, visual space, I say it's hyperbolic, and it is a dome, and the distances are compressed in the z direction. But I still have a spherical symmetry that is inherited from the azimuth in this direction. So you can have maybe mathematically a product of spherical symmetry plus one hyperbolic dimension. Was there another question?
Yes, but all this estimate depends also on time, because the estimate of neural activity, when the subject is moving, you have very little time to estimate firing rates or whatever you measure. And all this will become very, very noisy if you are measuring a mouse running in a...
It's
or
true.
my hand
Yes,
hitting
yes.
a ball.
So that's where the limits of the neural measurement comes in, and I'll show you that in some ways we approach that limit, and you would need new data to answer the next question. But to some extent, of course, this space is not fixed. It's kind of breathing, because the neural measurements are variable, either because of adaptation or because of the learning. So when we try to estimate the space from small chunks, then it becomes harder and harder to do. But still, you can make some progress. And then other questions, you say, well, the data is not quite sufficient to answer the question.
My traditional way to overcome the limitation is to go to populations instead of single neuron and see.
Yes.
I have some additional statistics. Okay.
Yes.
Are you using this, or?
Well, you can always, you know, if you measure more neurons, then you can estimate from smaller segments in time. Okay, so then I think in monitoring the time, I will just skip this. You just say that we have evidence for hyperbolic geometry in 3 dimensions for this recording. So this is these topological characteristics. This is the data. No, the data is in the dashed line, and solid line is what you would expect for the same number of points plus the spread. And with hyperbolic geometry, they're consistent, and with Euclidean, they're not consistent. Now, going back to this question of breathing, that this space is not static. And that was actually one of the criticisms of Lüneburg's theory of visual space, is that they would find that the space doesn't have a constant curvature, but if you have some landmarks, then there will be a perturbation, so it's not a constant space. But here what is shown is how the size increases with learning or with experience. So there's no learning task, but the animal just experiences, brought day after day to the same chamber, and the curvature is slightly greater at the end than in the beginning. And it's a logarithmic dependence, and it turns out that this dependence exactly is the maximal increase in the entropy that the space could have grown if information is chunked with a time t0. So its information is log 1 plus t over t0 is the maximum entropy that the space could have grown. And the relationship with between the networks and information is an interesting one, because if you go back to the canonical paper where information was introduced by Claude Shannon, he had 3 postulates for what information has to be. It had to be edited. One of the things it had to do is that if you had a tree-like structure, the information from branches should be additive. So if we have a process with 1/2, 1/3, and 1/6, and I can represent it as one branch point plus another one that branched into 2/3 and 1/3, that the information at the one level has to be additive with information with the previous level. And so the tree structure is actually baked into the definition of the entropy. And now we are getting it back by saying that with learning, the tree increases, and the kind of the size of the radius of this tree is the information that the animal could have gotten. And so there were, I would say, a few interesting observations that I would like to highlight. One of them is this question of recording from larger populations size. And this is in the simulation, but it asks for a given population size, what is the optimal tree size that will convey maximum amount of information about the animal's position. So you do a simulation, you put the place cells, and you ask how accurately one can determine animal's position from that population. And if the number of neurons is small, the optimal tree size, or the hyperbolic radius, is small, and then it increases the bigger the number of neurons. And finally, if you put it all on the same graph, the extrapolation gives you the curvature that we record corresponds to the projected number of neurons in CA1. So it says that you recorded from a small population of neurons, but they know how big is the population is, and so the curvature is congruent with what you would expect for the projected number of neurons in the brain region. So I will just maybe, just for fun, we're in the last 10 minutes. So I will just show you, I'm at the Salk Institute. There is a lot of crosstalk between neuroscience and other biological sciences. So I learned this interesting observation. This is about plant science, and I will ask, how, in my mind, it's related to aging and active sensing. So I thought a seed is a seed. It needs some minerals. In this case, she's studying manganese and iron. So as long as it's in the seed, it's okay. So they did an X-ray image of a seed and look at the exquisite precision with which manganese atoms are positioned in a seed. So when the plant will be growing, it's not going to say, oh, dear root, give me some manganese atoms. The atoms need to be where they in the right size of the plant. So I was inspired by how much biology cares about entropy minimization and order. And but in part of it, so we have been studying from a molecular perspective gene expression data of various cell types, and asking if, what geometry describes the population of measurements of different cells, and how it changes as a function of age. And it turns out that the geometries, not only geometry is hyperbolic at one time point, but when you put all the points as a function of age, it turns out that you can plot it ironically as an hourglass. So the young samples are on top. This is the green line. And then you have this hourglass trajectory, and the elderly samples are here in red. And it turns out that you can, by plotting, starting a geodesic from the first two youngest samples, you can predict where it's going to go, and the final positions are kind of follows from the developmental time points. So it is early days, but I just wanted to share with you this. And then these crosses here in the middle age, this is actually Alzheimer's patients, and so it seems like they are elderly, but it seems like the trajectory started to go off this normal aging hyperboloid at around the middle age. So that's just fun with hyperbolic geometry and the gene expression. And another part is, remember how I was telling you that in order to move the trajectory, you have to have discrete jumps. And here we have these oscillations in the hyperboloid of about 10 years. So that's, and if you go, there is another paper which was highlighted in New York Times about how there is a periodicity or the changes in increased noise or variability in gene expression at ages 40 and 60, I think, something like that. So what I'm intrigued by is whether these oscillations have something to do with those oscillations. So I think I will maybe conclude here. And this is hello from my group. This is early days from before COVID. And Yon Cheng-Zhou started our hyperbolic work. And Huanzhou did work on hippocampus. And Anup developed these various methods for scaling to large numbers of cells. And the aging part is together with Rusty Gage, and Ha Dongjin is working on this. So thank you for your attention.
Small technical question. So in the learning, you showed that when you learn a location, the curvature increases. you mean the absolute value of the curvature, or is it becoming less negative and more flat?
It becomes more negative.
More negative.
Yeah, so the larger the curvature in absolute value, the bigger is kind of the extension, and the bigger is the tree.
So what's a positive then? Like, how does the tree look in a positive sphere?
There is no tree.
There is no tree.
There is no tree. The moment you have a tree, you have a negative curvature. And then the positive, I guess, I don't know. So, the opposite of a tree. But the tree can have some loops. So, I think that's advantage that the geometry, you know, sometimes people ask me, so we have all these hierarchical clustering methods. Why do I need a map? Why can't I just have a tree? And I would say the reason, for my opinion, two reasons. One is the tree might not be a perfect tree. You can have some loops. And then the other reason is to ask what is the dimensionality of the space, which the tree cannot really answer.
When moving between environments, does it keep the same curvature? Is it a property of the system or of the environment, the curvature?
So the environment, I would say, is the stimulus. And when you change stimuli, the neural responses will change, and they could maybe change the dimensionality, but it could also be that, you know, there are limits beyond which it cannot change.
No, but the curvature. You have a curvature for this type of workspace. You said I assume it's a constant curvature.
Yeah, it's a constant curvature, yes, but it grows, but it doesn't. So in this analysis, when we model the space, we say it's a space of constant curvature. But the reality is it's not a constant curvature space. So the good model for this space is like broccoli, right? So if you give more nutrients in one part of the tree, there will be more branching, and there will be a higher curvature in one part than in the other part. So if I'm learning new part of the space or a new region of science, I will have more representation in that part than in the
So
other.
it's in the plasticity, in the connectivity that what determines the curvature.
So that's right. So one of the parts that we couldn't answer, and I kind of skipped over this. So the space is breathing. So the moment the animal runs slower, then for that part it forms a more kind of larger network, larger tree with a higher curvature. But what I would like to know, if the environment, the entropy of the environment is larger and it runs the same amount of time in environments with different entropy, will the expansion rate be different? And right now, with this data set, we couldn't answer that question. It was mainly about time, not in terms of the entropy of the environment. Maybe because the entropy wasn't that varied.
The entropy will depend on time and how much the animal explodes.
Yeah, so I think it's only, you know, for this hippocampal data, it was predominantly about time. And I would guess that's because of all the plasticity mechanisms that need to take place.
Related to this answer, you did show us basically what happens during learning, relearning. Like when I learn something new. So the stimuli are not the only thing that change, but also the context in which the stimuli are presented to me. For example, that's something I can learn, right? Don't respond to this stimulus, don't move to this stimulus, don't do something like this, do something else. A new association between the stimulus and the action. So the data, maybe the data you need, the data will be learning. Learning in the sense that I didn't know something and now the context of something has changed in the network that would require a different action in the same stimuli.
Yeah, I can't answer.
you look at artificial networks or AI, they are learning in some space to develop.
Say it again.
If artificial networks, you're training them on this data, are they developing?
You mean monitor the artificial neural network?
Yeah.
Yes, I tried a little bit. It was inconclusive for now. I mean, I was trying to whether if it is chaotic or not chaotic, what will be the. We did a little bit with learning in multi kind of population neural networks, and yeah, I'm not ready. So it looks like it was a logarithm of the number of population, was the curvature, but only in when each recurrent population was on this boundary of chaotic regime, and then you had non-zero curvature, something like that. So, but it's not ready. Well, yes. Thank you for your question.
Whether they obey, I will send you. I will send you the paper, which is published only in Bioarchive. And you have a look, and then we decide.
So, one is describe the hierarchical organization. So does that imply that we expected discrete changes, or is there a limit?
So, I would say hyperbolic space is continuous. So you can have intermediate, it's not like you have a discrete, really discrete number of stages. So you can have neurons that are populating this space in a continuous manner.
But then, if we visualize, there's the plot, the punctual plot, we showed a few times. So that shows discrete steps. Right? That's a way to think about it. But
yes, that's a way to think. Yes, there are other ways of thinking about it. And
that are continuous and not discrete.
That's
the
right.
number of levels.
Yes, so you have, first of all, you can have like a continuous coordinates x and y. So this is a discrete visualization, but it can be anywhere on that plane. So it just x and y, and the metric is dx squared plus dy squared over y squared.
So that's literally xy points on a hyperbola.
Yes, and then you can also have in a circle, also the same distance, and you uniformly, well, exponentially distributed number of points, but continuous.
Okay. And then the second question is, if you measure curvature of the stimuli, you mentioned there that you can measure the curvature of the stimuli and in neural space, right?
Yeah. So you can measure the space of stimuli, the curvature for the space of stimuli, or the curvature for the space of stimuli as seen by the, or represented by neural responses.
So suppose you do it for the stimuli,
Yes.
and we're talking about positions,
Yeah.
representations of space. So you can show on a given space what the curvature is in every position.
No. The curvature is constant. Assumed to be constant. In the future, you can have a space with non-constant curvature, which is harder to say.
Okay. And if the curvature is indeed constant, that means points that are near the edges are farther away, because those are the distortions you mentioned in the beginning, right? So if an animal is in a big square box, points near the edges are expected to be farther away from each other than points in the center.
Yeah, that's right. So, well, meaning the triangles, the little triangles, they all have the same size, but there are many of them. So the distance increases exponentially with the radius.
And does that replicate in the actual representation in the sequence?
So you can, how many points you can fit on one, how many points you can distinguish about the edges.
Finished your class already?
Yes.
Do you have time for some questions? Very nice talk. Very cool. Regarding regarding the results about intents and predicting remember correctly, probably done the radius of the receptor from the Sharpee.
הם באים ומרשים אותי על הנשיונליטי, בגלל שישראל מרגישה ערבים בגלל הנשיונליטי, זה כאילו, הם עושים אותו דבר.
חודשים מתנה, ובתוך המקיפה
can look into it. Can we get all the stuff in here?
Yeah.
Yeah, fine.
Watch.
Yeah. No, just means that there are also just like, security issues with it. Yeah, that's correct. You're welcome.
משהו יפה, לא הייתה השוואה לאחר. כיף ללמד בו. אמור להיות אם יהיו פה דוברי אנגלית.
כן, יש פה דוברי אנגלית.
כן, זה supposed to be.
והמבחן גם באנגלית?
אין מבחן, זה עבודה.
זה עבודה.
לא ראיתי את הקורס עדיין במודל.
יש כאן בעיות עם המודל.
כן, אני יודע, לכולם יש.
אנחנו מאותגרים, וזה קרה שיסתדר, בסדר? אז הכל יעלה מסודר.